Welcome to today's episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Altieri from Borough of Edgewood PD. He has almost 26 years experience in law enforcement, 26 years and a couple days, and he served 25 years with the Metropolitan Police Department in DC and now is Chief of Police at his existing agency. Welcome to the show, Chief Altieri. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited and happy to talk with you.
Yeah, me too. When you and I talked offline, you told me that you used to be a punk rock kid, and I thought that that was so funny because I was too. Like I'm,
Okay.
all tatted up and very like rocker chick when I was younger. And so I'm really interested to hear a little bit about your background. But what was your life before law enforcement? What was your childhood like? How did you grow up?
My childhood was okay. I grew up in a pretty stressful environment, actually. I think that's what led me to law enforcement. There was a lot that went on when I was a kid that I kind of wish someone would have come and stopped it, and it never got stopped. So it kind of creates a sense of almost like when the people talk about PTSD, when you're in this constant state of like readiness or constant state of almost saying an anxiety. So growing up wasn't great. I was drawn to the punk rock music scene in the 80s, back in the day, well before your time, here in Pittsburgh, which is where I was born here. And I was actually part of the music scene with punk music, crossover, thrash for about, gosh, I don't know, probably 10 years. So I went in the military. Um, it's weird. Even when I was doing that kind of music and, you know, I was trying to express myself in certain ways, and it still didn't, I never thought like anything bad about law enforcement. It's interesting because a lot of times when people think about punk kids, they always think like, we don't like the police or it's anti-authoritarian. It's really interesting. There's quite a few people here from Pittsburgh that actually went on into careers in law enforcement that were parts of the Pittsburgh punk music scene. So it's an actual kind of interesting thing. I don't know if it has something to do with the more blue collar roots here, how we were brought up, but I know quite a few people who've actually gone on into law enforcement. I know a few that are just getting ready to retire now. So I wouldn't say it was unusual. The one thing I liked about it is it really gave me a perspective, an outsider's perspective on things. When it came to dealing with people, it sort of taught me to be more accepting, which is something I think that sometimes we lack in law enforcement. We're not as accepting of other cultures. We're not accepting of other people's sexuality, their expression, their right to free speech. Sometimes you'll see police that are very sort of like, not militaristic, but not as trying to be understanding about other people. And I think that really helped me actually a great deal in law enforcement. In the early 90s, probably 92, I decided I needed to do something with my life. I felt like I like service. So I didn't know what to do. No one in my family really was doing much of anything as far as police or anything like that. So I didn't even think about law enforcement at the time. I went in the military. And I spent a number of years in the military. When I got out, I had a really good friend, Sergeant Mike Bain, who was a U.S. Park police officer who passed away on duty, unfortunately, a few years ago. And he was the one who sort of inspired me and motivated me to get into law enforcement. He's like, you love helping people. You like working in an environment with structure. You like, trying to plan things. You would really be good as a cop. And I'd never thought about it. I'd never even imagined it. I worked on ambulances before, done all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it kind of led me into it. And I joined the Metropolitan Police Department in 2000, April 2000, actually, was my hire date for MP.
I love that story. I have a couple questions for you because
Please.
I can relate to having a hard upbringing. And I and this is my experience. And so I'm curious if you kind of felt the same way, but I feel like for me, a lot of what I did outside of the home, when I was an adult and had the opportunity to have more control and freedom, that's exactly what I like strove for. Like it was almost a little rebellious, I think, to a lot of people, like the things that I did, but I think I was really craving that control that I felt like I didn't have in my upbringing. I felt like I wanted freedom so badly by the time I was 18 that I just like burst out of the house and was like, I need to experience everything because I had felt like I didn't have control or freedom over the things that were going on that were really, really hard in my household at the time. I don't know if you felt like that at all, like kind of coming out of a hard upbringing and being like, this is my opportunity to have that control that I didn't have before, or have that freedom that I didn't have before. And for me, when I did these things and, was kind of living my young adult life, and I felt like, there was maybe a little bit of, I don't know what word I'm thinking of, but it was just so refreshing to me to be able to choose things, because I felt like for so long I didn't have the choice over the things that I was experiencing.
Yeah, I think there's a feeling of helplessness. I think when you're growing up in
Yeah.
a sort of more chaotic environment, an environment that has a lot of explosive stress, where you kind of don't know what's going to happen from one minute to the next, I think there is a lot of loss of control. So I kind of feel that way. Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand what you're talking about with wanting to do other things. For me, it was more, I think, with the punk thing, I think it was more about trying to find a sense of community
Mm.
where I could express myself. I think it was a lot of that. And I think it's like, it's probably, I would say it's probably one and the same. Definitely I wanted to go out and, write songs and write music and do shows. And, we would put our own shows on, produce our own tapes, make our own t-shirt. I think it was kind of a sense of, yes, you had a control, but plus you sort of felt more a part of a community, which is something, I necessarily didn't feel at home. My parents tried really hard. I just think that there's issues, and I think sometimes they're challenging to overcome, especially back then. Now, people are more apt for therapy and things like that. But in the '60s, '70s, that was not something people did. They kind of just powered through, which isn't probably always the best when you're trying to raise kids. That's one of the reasons I never really myself thought about having kids. I just came from an environment where I don't really know what, I don't want to say a normal family, because there's no such thing as a normal, but I don't really know what a family is supposed to be like that doesn't kind of have chaos. I can, like, myself and my marriage is fine, but with kids, I just don't know. You know what I mean? I just didn't know a good way to do it. So I've always kind of steered clear. Now, of course, I don't. Hopefully, at this point in time, we'll be having any kids. I don't have to work forever then.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because that was one of my biggest fears when I was growing up, because I didn't have a mom in my life really at all.
Okay.
And I was always so afraid of having kids, because I was like, I don't know what a good example of being a mom is. I was raised by a single stepdad, and my biological father also wasn't really in my life. And so for me, I was like, man, I'm going to be so bad at it. I just don't even know where to start or what to do. And it was always my biggest fear. And as I got older and started, having those conversations of, do I want to start a family? Is this something that I want to do? I kind of came to the conclusion that I think, because I know what not to do,
Mm-hmm.
that means that I'd be good at it. At least for me, I was
No,
like,
that makes sense.
I know exactly how I wouldn't want my kids to feel. And I feel like a lot of times, our hardest things that we go through in our life are our biggest opportunities to learn and to grow and to do better. And I don't think that I would have the same outlook on life and the things that I do professionally if I wouldn't have gone through some of the hard things that I went through in my life. And to me, and I had written this down when you and I talked offline, to me, I don't know if you feel the same way, but it didn't seem like maybe you would have thought about law enforcement if you hadn't gone through some of the things that you had gone through, and having this deep drive to do better and to help people. And you said that you were in an environment where you wish someone would have come and helped, and then you now want to be that person that helps. And so I think it's a really cool story that, even though you came through from a really hard upbringing, you were able to turn that into something really positive.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it is interesting. I didn't realize that it took many years of therapy to finally come to that understanding. But because sometimes I think it's natural. We all kind of think about what drove us to do certain things, and for me, it was always trying to somehow help. If it wasn't working, it was in the military, trying to serve my country. It was as a medic, trying to work on ambulance. It was always about wanting to help, just because I think of what happened growing up, and I think I don't want to say fortunate, but I think I'm better off. I think it did drive me. I think if I didn't have that environment, I would have never went where I went in law enforcement with my first agency, and I probably wouldn't be at the job I'm at now either. Because I think it just kind of gave me something inside where it it really made me more compassionate, more empathetic.
Mhm.
And I know that's not really something we talk about a lot as police officers and things like that. But I really, I found as a leader, showing empathy and showing compassion and being genuine with your people, that's helped me succeed like my entire career. Either if it's a community where I was before that traditionally doesn't really like law enforcement initially, and we have to kind of go in and win people over, or if it's with a new group or I'm running a new unit, I think that's what, at least for me, that's what works. I'm not the come in and like Coach Bill Cowher, who's from the Steelers, who's like, fire and brimstone. That's just not me, but I think it can work. And I do think it's because of the way I was brought up that happened. Sure. So I'm not, I don't know if I'm grateful for my childhood, but I do accept it and understand it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that compassion and empathy are superpowers. But you're right. I think that it takes a lot of maybe vulnerability to show that, to take down those walls and to show people that you care. And sometimes, as we, especially I think as we progress in our careers, we kind of build this like tough person facade. And we think that showing empathy or compassion negates that. And I think that that's completely untrue. I think that you can be effective and you can be strong and you can be tough and all of these things. And you can be caring and compassionate and empathetic and you can be authentic and you can be vulnerable. All of these things can be true at once.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's where the growing up as a punk kid kind of,
Mm.
I never felt like, even in the military, like I was 101st Airborne before I retired from the military, before I left, and I was an NCO, and I never was any different than I am right now as far as dealing with people. And I had good results with it because I never felt like, I never felt being compassionate or caring was a weakness. I never felt exposed. Believe me, I worked for plenty of people that did feel that way, but I also worked for plenty of people that were like, well, you get results, so it's fine. It's kind of cool how like now, if you look at all this leadership stuff they talk about now, they're really talking more and more about servant leadership. Where if you'd have talked about that 20 years ago, there were people that would be on board, but there were people that'd be like, oh, that's weak, that's weak.
Yeah.
Like, when I remember during 9/11, my sergeants, we were working so much in DC, my sergeants were just like, if you don't like it, just quit. And yeah, 25 years ago, that works. If you say that to an average roll call right now in an overworked metropolitan district, you're probably getting some takers. So, that it's important that we understand that.
Yeah, you could maybe threaten that back in the day and it wouldn't have as much of an impact now, especially with the struggles with hiring and recruitment.
No. Well, think about it. You have a more educated workforce now than you've ever had because most places require college. You probably have, I don't know the statistics, but I would imagine you probably have more educated people than your prior service people because the military is good because you're used to things being bad and you can accept things better. But it's tough. I mean, if you're not willing to try to understand generations that are working on, we have like multiple generations working now. I mean, like right here, for example, we have a boomer, we have a lot of Gen X's, we have Gen Z. We have there's like there's four groups of people working right now, and you kind of have to be different with everybody, and understand that the way you talk to me, it's probably not going to work if you talk to someone who's 25 years old. They're going to be a little more intolerant of that sort of, self.
Yeah. And I think that that is one of the biggest learning lessons when it comes to teaching or it comes to leadership is how can you say things that resonate with everybody? How can you motivate everybody? Everyone learns differently. Everyone's going to be motivated by different things. It's almost like that old adage of like, you know, you can skin a cat. What was it like? There's 10 different ways or whatever, it's like you have to be able to say something 100 different ways to be effective.
Mhm.
And that's
And to do
hard.
that, I think you have to be sincere. And if you mess up or you say something wrong, I said something one time in a roll call as a district commander when I was in DC, and it was slang terminology. One of my sergeants came to me and they're like, "Hey, just so you know," I use the term ninja because we had guys like committing all these robberies dressed in black ski mask and black stuff. Well, I didn't know, according to social media, that's used as sort of as a way people speak on social media to use a derogatory term towards like African Americans. I didn't know that. She was like, "Hey, just so you know, I'm just telling you." She's like, "No one's mad because they all know you." And I'm saying, so I went to roll call and I'm like, "I apologize." I'm like, "Hey, if it offended anybody, I didn't know that. I didn't know that was a thing." You know what I mean? So I think we have to like listen to people that we are in charge of and that we're working with and sort of try to see their perspective. Now, does that mean everybody gets what they want? No. But I mean, you have to really pay attention, listen to people. I think that's really one of the most important things. And it's interesting, like when I first became a recruit, the one thing I noticed at the police academy is how little people would listen. Like you would tell somebody something and they were hearing, they talk about curse of knowledge, where people hear what they kind of want to hear because they have a limited perspective of where you're coming from. And it always freaked me out because you would think as a police officer, and especially like when you become a detective and you're doing investigations, listening is probably like the most important skill for your average patrolman, for your average detective. And it's also a super important skill for like leaders because we have to take stuff in and understand it and have clarity. And it just amazed me that didn't exist. And I don't think that was something that was necessarily specific to my agency. I think that's just something that, you see with people, a bit, quite a bit where people just don't pay attention. And I think in order to lead multiple generations, you have to be willing to listen to that. And you have to see what their strengths are and understand everybody's got their own strengths, their weaknesses. And you have to be very cognizant of it. I mean, it's not hard. You just have to be willing to do it.
Yeah. Do you know what I find to be really interesting to the point of listening? How many times have you or anyone who's listening gone to a conference and you're there to learn, right? We're here to like listen to keynote speakers. And how many of us or how many people around us are on their phones the whole time?
That's an interesting. Yeah, the phone thing is really interesting to me. That is bizarre. I remember being in a cohort at GW, and people would just be on their phone every once in a while, and you're just thinking like, "What are you doing, man?" Like, we're supposed to be tracking what's going, but you see it a lot, and unfortunately, that's one of those things where you have to find a way. You have to find a way, I think, when you're doing presentations to kind of work around it, or you just ignore it because that's kind of like the culture now. I used to do a lot of training for the sexual harassment officers for the District of Columbia, and there'd be like, 60, 70 people to a class. And we would have that. And I just kind of learned to kind of tune it out because if not, it probably would drive me crazy.
Yeah.
Like, you
Yeah.
playing Angry Birds or you're responding to an email? Like, what's going on there? What's happening? So,
Yeah, well, and I think the question is, and I think we can all ask ourselves this because there are things that I'm sure do need your attention right then and there, right? And I know that a lot of people are on call and have certain things, but I think the question to ask ourselves is, do we absolutely have to have our phones for this hour presentation? Do we absolutely have to respond to that email? Do we absolutely have to respond to the text? Sometimes that answer might be yes. Like sometimes maybe like there's a fire and you have to put it out. But I would say probably if I had to guess, 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, that you can watch an hour-long presentation and give someone your respect and your time, and you can listen to what they have to say for that hour. And it's okay if an email goes unanswered. But yeah, I've done plenty of keynote presentations, and I've been kind of, asking myself that question because the one thing you don't want to do is be like, everyone put down your phones. And then you feel like everyone hates you for that hour because you just told them what to do. But I think maybe rather, posing the question or like maybe even giving the option of like, hey, if you don't absolutely have to have your phone for this hour and we can put it down and we can be present with each other, then that would be really appreciated. Maybe that's something that can be kind of preset, but yeah, you do kind of have to ignore it. But I think it's funny. It's like, are we being present? Are we giving people the time and attention that they deserve? Because people are coming to teach us things. They're at the front. They put a lot of work and energy. There's a lot of anxiety around people public speaking. Like I try to have that sort of empathy too. When people are presenting to me, like understanding the amount of time and work and energy and effort, and they're probably nervous, to get up and to do this. And so the least I can do is give my attention to that person who's trying to teach me something. But one of the things that you told me offline that I wanted to kind of mention is that you're a really big advocate for mindfulness and being present. And I want to dive into that a little bit and kind of understand, when did that become a part of the picture for you? When did you start learning these methods? And, what have been some of the benefits that you've seen from those practices?
So I had I don't want to go into too much detail, but I had a critical incident when I was working with MPD, and it was it affected me pretty adversely, where I was having a lot of issues going to work. I'd be driving to work, I'd have to stop and be sick. I couldn't sleep. I had all these triggers. It was not good. And I was going to the police and fire clinic because they put me out for a little bit. And one of the doctors there recommended, I didn't like medication. Like, I didn't like the medication. They had me on medication. I didn't like it. And we had a great doctor in the DC police, still has, Dr. Beverly Anderson. She's awesome. She runs their MEAP down there. And she told me, I should really try to look at alternative methods to medication, since I didn't like medication. And I started doing EMDR. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
So I found a doctor, paid for it myself, and started doing EMDR. And, there's different schools of thought. Some people think it's legit, some people don't. I don't care. It worked for me. In my instance, I was able to come off my medication. I haven't had any issues in, gosh, I don't know, like 15 years now, maybe, or 13 years. It's been a while. Haven't had any issues. And when I started doing that, I really wanted to explore more about ways to sort of cope with stress. With this job, you see, especially when I was working in like youth investigations, where we're doing like child sex crimes and physical abuse investigations, I saw a lot of people that had, it was tough to cope. A lot of people overate. Some people couldn't sleep. Some people turned to drinking, or, I mean, not everybody, but people have, it's hard. It's a hard thing to cope with. Right. And I said, man, there's got to be like another way. So I actually got into transcendental meditation. I don't know if you ever talked about this on your show before. It's interesting because, it started off as kind of like sort of like a trendy sort of thing in the 60s, or almost like a commune thing. But as time progressed in the 90s and stuff, it really started to translate into business. And a lot of business leaders started practicing it. And I said, let me check this out. So I started doing TM, and it really helped. I mean, it really made me feel present and focused all the time. It was really interesting because how many times, think about this, like how many times are you doing one thing, but you're thinking, oh, I got to do this. I have to do this. It's just constant, right? And then imagine when you're doing casework, you're constantly doing that. You're doing an interview, you're focusing on the interview, but at the same time in the back of your mind, you're like, okay, I have to do this. And it's just not a healthy way to live. And I think because of things like phones and that, we have such a connection where it's constant input. And I think all of this sort of just affects us as people. I'm not saying like electromagnetic waves or anything, no conspiracy theories. Let me be clear. But what I'm saying is, I think it affects us because it's just a lot going on all the time. And I started doing TM, and I noticed like I would be at work and stuff would be happening. And I just felt like I was there. That's what I was dealing with. Like right now, talking to you, this is what I'm doing. I'm not thinking about what I have to do when I get off this call. I'm not thinking about doing it. And that's really helped me. With that, I started to do yoga and things like that. And I just found personally, it's helped. I had a really great assistant chief on MPD when I was a young lieutenant, and he came as Chief Burke. So Patrick Burke's amazing. I don't know if you'll ever see this, but he came and talked to our class, and he said, listen, as you get promoted and you're going to be dealing with more stuff and things are going to come at you faster, you have to have certain things. He said, you have to remember to educate yourself. You have to have time alone. You have to have family time, and you have to have some sort of, he called it faith, but he didn't mean it in a religious way. He said, if that was your thing, if you're a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, fine. But he talked about it more from the perspective of a mindfulness thing. Mm-hmm. And it really made sense to me to have those things. And I've really tried to do that ever since he talked about it. And that's really helped me. So I actually, as a district commander in DC police, I actually brought somebody in who would do mindfulness with the officers before roll call. Her name was Holly Myers. She's awesome. She's a yogi. She's not a yogi. She'd kill me if I said that. She's a yoga practitioner. So I met her through yoga. But she would come in and do mindfulness breathing with the officers, and they really seemed to like it. And a lot of them, since I left, it hasn't continued, unfortunately. But they've talked about how it helps them so much in stressful situations, how the breathing things she's taught them on their way to a call, they can do the breathing as they're coding to like a shooting scene or a robbery, and it just centers them. So I think it's a really good thing, and it might be anything. I mean, for you, it might be prayer. It doesn't matter. It's just I think we need something, and I think it's important as an organization, as a profession. I think it's something law enforcement has to, sort of reckon with at some time when you're working officers more and more. There's, more overtime. There's less people. They're under more stressful situations. They're doing more calls for service. There has to be a way for them to find relief. And I will say, like, I came from an organization that they knew that, and they tried to bring wellness into it as well. Yeah, and I think it's a great thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be TM. It doesn't have to be yoga. It could be whatever you want it to be. There's plenty of apps online that teach you how to do it. But yeah, I do recommend it. And it's also great for leaders because it's a good way to kind of de-stress, when you're done for the night or you're done for the day. I mean, if you're working crazy shifts, you've got 100 meetings, it's kind of a really good way to get yourself centered and relaxed.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things, because I agree with you. You're speaking my language, and I have a very similar story to yours in the sense that I had really bad panic attacks, really bad anxiety, and I was just tossed medication as well,
Mhm.
and I didn't like it at all. And so, mindfulness, meditation, grounding, those are things that really helped me. And I was able to manage my anxieties better, get off all the antidepressants that they gave me, and my panic attacks actually completely went away. And so I agree that it's super effective. And I think if we take a look at how this applies to law enforcement specifically, one, you have to have a clear mind to make effective decisions. If you don't have a clear mind, how are you going to be effective in the way that you respond to things? The other thing is when you can regulate your nervous system, it's going to help with everything, including the number one thing that we're talking about a lot. Actually, I would say top two things that we're talking about a lot, but one is sleep. If your mind is constantly thinking about a bunch of stuff and you're looping, you're never going to have the quality of sleep that you need to also be able to be effective. And then cardiovascular health. If you're always stressed and your nervous system is up here and your heart is on overdrive constantly, it's not good. So, how can we have those resources that are going to regulate your nervous system? Lower your cortisol, lower your heart rate, your blood pressure, so that you can have less stress, you can sleep better, and you can make better decisions. And so I think if we can like have those conversations, people are like, oh, that makes sense, and it doesn't feel so like out of the box. It's like, no, this is tactical training. This is something that's only going to benefit you and the organization moving forward. And so I like to have a lot of those types of conversations of like, what are the outcomes? Because if we can talk about the outcomes and the benefits, and I think people get more on board with things, and they're less skeptical.
Yeah, makes sense.
My final question for you, and I know that you've shared some wisdom already, but for that younger generation who are entering into the career today, what words of wisdom would you share with them that maybe you wish you would have known when you were younger, or something that's helped you along the way?
I'm going to say this because something I think about a lot, and I get asked it a lot too, is this: the people that want your help the least in this job are generally the people that need you the most.
Mm.
And that's what you're going to find. And as police, our job is to try to win those people up. If you have a community where there's a high crime rate, and I'm not talking about the citizens who are affected by crime, I'm talking about people committing the crimes that maybe don't like the police, that's fine. But there has to be you have to understand that those folks need your help too. Like, what can you do besides arresting them, which is our job? Is there other things you can do? Is there other ways you can help that community? I think it's hard. I think, man, if I came on when I was in my 30s, and I think about myself in my 20s, like before the military, and I think, man, how would I have fared in this job? And probably not very well. I remember we were doing a community walk a number of years ago, and one of my sergeants, we're talking to the community, and one of the community members, this was in Washington, one of the community members said, y'all don't talk to us anymore. And one of my sergeants, who's probably not 30 yet, is like, well, I used to say hi to people, but they'd always tell me to F myself. And I really started thinking about it. And I was like, yeah, like if I was under, like now me, I get it. You're not talking to me. I mean, you might be talking to me. Maybe you know me, you don't like me. But generally, you're talking to the uniform or what the uniform means to you. And it could be that you had a negative experience with the police. It could be that we've arrested your parent. It could be, we shot a family member. Or you could just have a bias against law enforcement because you feel that a certain way, you know? And I started thinking, it's got to be hard if you're a young person dealing with that. And I think that's part of the struggle right now to fill these positions in law enforcement is people don't want to come into the field because they don't want to be villainized. I think that is the biggest challenge right now. So I would say to the youngest people, you have to understand that those people that, again, that need you, that feel they need you the least, those are the ones you have to help. Those are the ones that you have to reach to make a real difference. That's where you're going to have success. And that's something you have to say in the back of your mind and know and think to yourself and say to yourself, they're not talking to me. They're talking to this patch here. They're talking to this badge. They're not talking to Sylvan. They're talking to this. And a lot of times if you talk to people and just have a conversation, not maybe politically, but like about a subject where they just kind of understand, oh, you're a person too. I think that helps. And sometimes it takes time. I mean, it makes an effort, but it's up to us to make the effort. It's not up to the citizen. We're the government agency. It's not up to the guy standing in the corner to take that effort. It's up to us. We're the ones that have to do it. And I think that's like the hardest thing these kids are dealing with right now is I think it's a shock to their system when they go to a neighborhood. Like here where I work now in Edgewood, we have very supportive people. The police, we did in DC too, but DC was bigger. So you would have a mixture of folks and you would have some folks that just, did not like the police. They just thought we were, and some of the reason they thought that was because we, for years, weren't always doing things the way we should do things. I mean, and so we had to change the way we did it, but it's still up to us to kind of be ambassadors in dealing with the public, and letting them know who we are.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about wellness and leadership and your words of wisdom.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just happy to be here.
Of course.